5. Finger confession. A story of compulsion, consequence, and the grace that wouldn't let go. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. 2 Corinthians 5:17. She was good at it. That's the part nobody talks about. When people tell stories about addiction and compulsion and the things that unravel a life, they talk about the shame and the consequence and the rock bottom. All of that is true, and all of that is coming. But first, she was good at it. She had been doing it since she was 8 years old, and she had never once been caught. Not in the corner store near her childhood home, not in the department stores of 3 different cities, not in the offices and the handbags and the coat pockets of people who called her a friend, not in 22 years of taking things that didn't belong to her. Never caught. Until the Tuesday morning at Hargrove's Fine Jewelry on Clement Street that changed the entire direction of her life, and not in the way she expected, and not by the person she expected, and not through the mechanism that anyone, including her, would have predicted. But we are getting ahead of the story. Her name is Meredith Oneshi. She is 30 years old, and this is the testimony she now stands up and tells in churches, specifically on Sabbath mornings at Calvary Seventh-day Adventist Church, when Pastor Douglas Ames asks her to, which he does several times a year because he says every congregation needs to hear what grace actually looks like when it gets its hands dirty. It looks like this. Before we move forward with the story, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to help us to grow this channel to uplift more people. It started the way most things that ruin you start, small enough to miss. Meredith was 8 years old, 2nd grade at Parkway Elementary in Columbus, Ohio. The middle child in a household that was held together by her mother Hannah's sheer force of will, and her father Franklin's long work hours, and the specific domestic tension of 2 people who loved each other and were exhausted by each other in almost equal measure. She was not neglected. She was not abused. She was not the product of a dramatic origin story, which is something she has had to make peace with. The fact that what grew in her did not require catastrophe to take root. It required only the ordinary friction of a childhood that was fine, but not quite enough, which is the most common childhood in the world. What she remembered from that first time was not hunger or need. She and her best friend Kezia had been at a dollar store after school, spinning the display racks of cheap jewelry the way 8-year-old girls do, trying on plastic rings, dragging bead necklaces across their wrists. When Meredith saw it, a small charm bracelet, silver-toned, with a tiny star pendant. It cost $1.49. She had $1.50 in her pocket. She didn't buy it. She put it in her jacket pocket instead. She did not know why. The decision, if it could be called a decision, happened below the level of deliberate thought. It was more like weather than choice, like something that came over her rather than something she made. Her heart hammered. Her palms went damp. She walked out of the store behind Kezia, and the cold October air hit her face, and the bracelet was in her pocket, and the world had not ended, and nobody had seen, and there it was. That feeling. She would spend 22 years chasing it, and hating herself for chasing it and chasing it again, and she would not have the vocabulary for it until she was 27 years old, sitting in a therapist's office, being told that what she had experienced in that dollar store at age 8 was the neurological signature of an impulse control disorder, a flood of dopamine that her particular brain chemistry had seized on and cataloged as relief, as release, as the answer to a question she hadn't even known she was asking. She would not know any of that for 19 years. At 8 years old, all she knew was that the feeling was unlike anything else, and that she wanted it again. By the time Meredith was in high school, the taking was methodical. She had rules. Never steal from people you love. Never steal something so large or distinctive it would be immediately missed. Never steal twice from the same place in the same month. Always have an exit strategy before you enter. Always know where the cameras are. These rules gave her the illusion of control, which is what rules always give people who are out of control. the feeling of being the author of something that is actually authoring them. She was an honor student. She ran track. She had friends who considered her one of the most trustworthy people they knew, which was a particular kind of irony she had learned to live inside without examining too closely. She went to church with her family on Sundays, a Baptist congregation where her mother sang in the choir and her father served as a deacon, and she participated and smiled and meant most of it and carried the rest of it in a locked compartment she kept rigorously separate from everything else. She went to Ohio State on a partial academic scholarship. She majored in communications. She was charming and capable and well-liked, and she stole from 3 different campus bookstores, 2 clothing boutiques, a campus pharmacy, and the unlocked desk drawers of 2 different resident advisors during her 4 years there. She graduated and moved to Atlanta for a marketing job, and she was good at the job, and she made friends, and she dated, and she built a life that looked, from every angle that mattered socially, like the life of a woman who had herself together. The storage unit she rented under a variation of her name, using her middle name, Abena, as her last name, was the only place the architecture of her double life was fully visible. 240 square feet of accumulated taking. Organized with the obsessive neatness of someone who needed to control something because everything else felt uncontrollable. She went there sometimes just to look at it. This is the detail she finds hardest to explain when she tells her story. Not the stealing itself, but the looking. The sitting on the floor of a storage unit, surrounded by things that weren't hers and feeling briefly like she had something, like she had mass, like she took up space in the world in a way that she couldn't seem to feel anywhere else. She knows now what that was. The therapist gave it a name. The pastor gave it a context. But at 28, sitting on the floor of a storage unit in Marietta, Georgia, she just knew that she felt something there that she didn't feel anywhere else, and it frightened her, and she kept going back. Here is the thing about compulsion that the rules can't stop. It escalates. Not because the person wants it to, because tolerance builds, because the thing that used to produce relief requires more to produce the same relief, because the architecture of control eventually has too many rooms to maintain. For Meredith, the escalation happened at 28 in the form of jewelry. She had always avoided jewelry. Too high value, too easily noticed, too many cameras in the cases. She had held to that rule with absolute consistency for 20 years. Then she walked into a jewelry store in Buckhead to buy a gift for her mother's birthday and stood at the case looking at a pair of pearl earrings and felt the feeling arrive with an intensity she hadn't experienced in years. Sharper, more insistent, almost aggressive, like a voice that had been getting quieter and had suddenly decided to shout. She did not take anything that day. She came back 3 days later and took a bracelet. Silver. Small diamonds at the clasp. Worth approximately $400. She walked out of the store in the practiced, unhurried way she had perfected since she was a teenager. Not too fast, not too deliberate, just a woman who had finished browsing and was moving toward the rest of her day. She made it to her car. She sat in the driver's seat with the bracelet in her hand, and the feeling at full volume and the shame behind it rising faster than it ever had before. And she thought, with a clarity that frightened her, "This is getting worse." She knew it was getting worse. She took the bracelet home anyway. Over the following 14 months, she took 7 more pieces of jewelry from 4 different stores. The rules were still in place. Different stores, different parts of the city, varied timing. But the frequency was increasing. The value was increasing. And the gap between the taking and the shame was closing, which meant the relief was lasting less time, which meant the compulsion was demanding more, sooner. She was 29 years old, and for the first time in 22 years of taking things, she was genuinely afraid of herself. Hargrove's fine jewelry on Clement Street was a mistake from the beginning. She knew it the moment she walked in. The store was smaller than she had assessed from the street, with tighter angles of visibility and a layout that left fewer blind spots than she needed. The sales staff ratio was higher than she had calculated. 3 associates for a showroom of that size was too many. She should have left. She didn't leave. This was the other thing about escalating compulsion. The judgment that had once been her protection was degrading. The careful calculation that had kept her safe for 22 years was being overridden more and more frequently by the sheer volume of the need. She was at the center display case, estate jewelry, a collection of vintage pieces under glass, a rose gold and sapphire ring on a velvet stand, when she felt the feeling arrive. Full force, immediate. The narrowing of the world to a single point that was the ring and her hand, and the 11 seconds between where she was and where she needed to be. She positioned herself at the edge of the case while an associate helped another customer at the far end. She noted the camera angle, covering the left side of the case, not the right. She had assessed this from the door. She was right-handed. She had done this before. She knew how. Her hand moved toward the unlocked display panel at the base of the case. What she did not account for, what the degraded calculation had missed, was the second camera. Not in the corner where she had looked. Embedded in the ceiling directly above the center case, angled straight down, installed 6 weeks ago as part of a security upgrade that Hargrove's had not advertised, because you don't advertise your security upgrades. She didn't know about it. The associate watching the monitor in the back office did. She had the ring in her palm and was moving toward the door, measured pace, relaxed shoulders, a woman who had looked at jewelry and decided against purchasing, when she heard it. "Ma'am." She kept walking, 1 step, 2, "Ma'am, I need you to stop, please." The voice was not aggressive. It was the specific, trained calm of someone who had been instructed to de-escalate while being firm. The voice of the store manager, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s named Terrence, who had appeared from somewhere to her left with a second associate flanking her right. The door was 10 feet away. She stopped. She stopped because she was 10 feet from the door with 2 people between her and it, and because some part of her, the part that was exhausted, the part that had been exhausted for years, but had never been louder than the compulsion until this exact moment, some part of her was done running. She turned around. Terrence said quietly, "Can I ask you to come with me to the back office?" She went. She sat in the chair they indicated and put the ring on the table in front of her without being asked. She heard Terrence on the phone. She heard the words police and evidence, and yes, we have it on camera. She sat with her hands in her lap and felt the shame arrive. Not in its usual measured way, but all at once, in a wave so large it was almost indistinguishable from relief. She did not cry. She was somewhere past the mechanism of crying. 2 officers arrived in 11 minutes. She was read her rights in the back office of a jewelry store on a Tuesday morning in October. She was handcuffed, the specific, cold, mechanical click of handcuffs being the sound she would hear in her memory for years afterward. The sound of 22 years arriving at their logical conclusion. She was walked through the front of the store. There were 4 customers in the showroom when she came through. She did not look at any of them. She looked at the floor. She was put in the back of a patrol car, and the door was closed, and she sat in the particular silence of a consequence that has finally arrived after a very long journey. She thought, with strange clarity, about the dollar store on a cold October day when she was 8 years old. She thought about Kezia, spinning the jewelry rack. She thought about the charm bracelet with the tiny star pendant. She thought it started with a star, and then she thought nothing for a long time. She was processed and placed in a holding cell at the county precinct. Her phone was in her purse, which was in evidence. She could not call anyone. She sat on the bench in the cell. She was alone in it, which was a small mercy, and stared at the opposite wall. She had a prior record, technically. 1 charge, 7 years ago, shoplifting, a misdemeanor she had managed with a fine and community service, and a lawyer her parents had never known she needed because she had told them the money she borrowed was for something else. It had not become public. It had not touched her professionally. This was different. This was a felony. This was on camera. This was a jewelry store with a manager who had clearly called police before she even left the building, which meant they had the footage and the timeline and the ring in an evidence bag. She sat on the bench and tried to calculate the damage, and couldn't because the calculation required a kind of functional thinking that she didn't currently have access to. What she had access to, instead, was a memory. She was 12 years old, a Sunday evening service at her parents' church. The choir had sung an old hymn. She couldn't remember the full title, only the refrain, which came back to her now with the precision of things learned in childhood. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me. She had never thought of herself as a wretch. Even now, sitting in a holding cell with the cold click of handcuffs still in her memory, her first instinct was to resist the word. She was educated. She was professional. She had told herself for 22 years, essentially a good person with a specific malfunction. Sitting on that bench, she let the word land. Wretch. Not as condemnation, as relief, as the mercy of being seen accurately after 22 years of being seen partially. Saved a wretch like me. She had not prayed in years. She had attended the occasional church service for social reasons, her family's expectations, a friend's wedding, and had sat in the pew with the mild disconnection of someone who has put their relationship with God on hold indefinitely, waiting for a better time, a tidier self, a version of her life that was presentable enough to bring back to the altar. She prayed now. Not eloquently, not with structure or theology or the language of someone who had kept up with her spiritual disciplines. She said, I have been hiding for 22 years. I am tired of hiding. I don't know what happens next. But I don't want to hide anymore. The holding cell was exactly the same after she said it. Cold bench, fluorescent light, opposite wall. But she was not exactly the same. Something had cracked open in the chest of her, and the air coming through it was cold and real, and the first completely honest thing she had felt in longer than she could measure. She was allowed one call. She sat with the phone for 60 seconds before she dialed. Not her mother. She could not hear her mother's voice right now. Not her sister. Same reason. Not a lawyer, she would need one, but not first. She called her friend Philippa. Philippa Asante had been Meredith's closest friend for 6 years. A quiet, steady woman who worked as a social worker and who Meredith had always sensed could handle more truth than most people, and who had, on 2 separate occasions over the years, looked at Meredith in the way that people look at someone when they know something is being withheld but have chosen to wait rather than press. Philippa answered on the second ring. Meredith said, without preamble, I'm at the county precinct. I was arrested this morning. I need you to know why, and I need to tell you the truth. Silence. Then Philippa said, I'm listening, Meredith told her. In a phone call from a precinct in 5 minutes, she told her more truth than she had told anyone in 22 years. The compulsion, the storage unit, the escalation, the jewelry stores. This morning, when she finished, Philippa said, Okay, just that. Okay. And then, I'm coming. Don't talk to anyone until I get there. Philippa arrived 40 minutes later. She had made 2 calls on her way, one to her own attorney, who agreed to take Meredith's case that afternoon, and one that Meredith would not find out about until 3 days later. The second call was to Pastor Douglas Ames of Calvary, Seventh-day Adventist Church. Philippa was Adventist. Meredith had known this, had attended Calvary once or twice over the years at Philippa's invitation, had found it warm and interesting and had not followed up, because following up would have meant being known, and being known was dangerous. Philippa had never pushed. She had extended the invitation consistently and gently and without pressure, and had continued to be Meredith's friend regardless. What Meredith did not know was that Philippa had been praying for her specifically, by name, at Calvary's Friday night prayer service for 4 years. She had never told Meredith this. She told her now, in the car leaving the precinct after Meredith was processed and released on her own recognizance. The October afternoon going gray around them. 4 years? Meredith said. 4 years, Philippa said. I didn't know what I was praying for exactly. I just knew something was wrong and you weren't going to tell me. And prayer was the only thing I could do that wasn't pressure. Meredith sat with that for a long time. 4 years of Philippa Asante at a Friday night prayer service, saying her name to God, not knowing what was being carried, but trusting that someone did. She thought about the holding cell, about amazing grace, about the prayer she had said to the opposite wall. She thought about the possibility that the prayer had been answered before she prayed it. "I need help," she said. It was not the first time in her life she had said those words, but it was the first time she said them without already planning how to manage the help so that it didn't get too close. "I know," Philippa said. "I've already called Pastor Ames." He came to Philippa's apartment that evening. He was not what Meredith had expected, which meant she had been expecting the wrong things. She had expected either the judgmental formality of a church official encountering sin or the aggressive compassion of someone determined to save her before she could breathe. Pastor Douglas Ames was neither. He was 63, lean, with reading glasses perpetually on the edge of his nose, and the patient, unhurried quality of someone who understood that trust is not produced by urgency. He sat in Philippa's living room and accepted the tea he was offered, and looked at Meredith with eyes that held no agenda she could detect. He said, "I understand you've had quite a day." Something about the plainness of it, the acknowledgement of the specific terrible reality of the day without layering it with theological interpretation, made her laugh. Briefly, unexpectedly, the laugh of someone who hadn't expected to laugh and needed to. "Yeah," she said, "quite a day." He told her about 2 Corinthians 5:17. He didn't preach it at her. He said it the way you share something that has personally mattered to you, the way you show someone a photograph. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. I want you to hear 2 things in this verse, he said. First, it says, if anyone. Not if the sufficiently religious person, not if the person who has gotten themselves cleaned up first. Anyone, including a woman who just got out of a holding cell. He paused. Second, it says the old has gone, past tense, completed action. Not the old will eventually go once you've earned it. Gone. The new is already here, waiting for you to step into it. Meredith looked at him. I have a disorder, she said. Not defensively, honestly. I'm not just someone who made bad choices. I have a clinical condition, a compulsion. It doesn't respond to willpower. I know, he said simply, which is why you need God and a doctor and a community, in no particular order. All 3. He looked at her. The verse doesn't replace the therapy. The therapy doesn't replace the verse. You need the whole thing. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a card on the table. A therapist's card, already written with an appointment time. I took the liberty. She looked at the card. You called ahead, she said. Philippa called ahead. I concurred, the faintest smile behind the reading glasses. She picked up the card. The legal process took 11 months. Her attorney, the one Philippa had called from the car, was thorough and specific, and managed to establish a mitigation framework built around the clinical diagnosis, the voluntary disclosure, and the treatment program Meredith entered within 2 weeks of the arrest. The judge, a woman who had presided over enough of these cases to understand the difference between predatory crime and compulsion, sentenced Meredith to 3 years probation, restitution, mandatory therapy, and 200 hours of community service. No prison time. She wept in the courtroom. Not from relief, or not only from relief, from the staggering, disorienting experience of being seen accurately by a system she had expected to see her only as what she had done. The mitigation letter from Pastor Ames, submitted to the court, was 2 pages and said, among other things, this woman did not walk into my church looking for reduced consequences. She walked in looking for truth. Those are different things. The first is strategy. The second is repentance. I know which one I witnessed. The therapist was named Dr. Coleman, a behavioral specialist who had worked with impulse control disorders for 20 years and who treated kleptomania with the clinical seriousness it deserved, not as moral failure requiring lectures, but as a neurological pattern requiring restructuring. The work was slow, non-linear. There were 2 relapses in the first 7 months. Small, caught quickly, processed without the catastrophic shame spiral that had previously been her only response to failure. She told Dr. Coleman. She told Pastor Ames. She told Philippa. She told them. That was new. That was the seismic shift beneath all the other shifts. That she was no longer carrying it alone. She joined Calvary Seventh-day Adventist Church formally 8 months after the arrest. Not because the court required it, not because Philippa had been praying for 4 years, though that mattered, but because she had sat in enough Sabbath services by then to know what she was tasting: truth, told without management, in a room full of people who were also trying to close the gap between who they were and who God made them to be. She wanted to be in that room. She got baptized on a Sabbath morning in June. Her mother and father sat in the front row. Her mother weeping in the specific way of a woman who has prayed for something a very long time and lived to receive it. Her father, who had not cried at anything in her living memory, sat next to her mother and stared straight ahead with the compressed expression of a man who was holding something enormous, very carefully. Philippa sat beside them. After the baptism, after the reception in the fellowship hall, after the hugs and the food, and the warmth of 40 people celebrating something real, Meredith found a moment alone on the church steps in the June afternoon. She thought about a dollar store in Columbus, Ohio, about an October afternoon and a plastic charm bracelet and a tiny star pendant and 8 years old and the beginning. She thought about Hargrove's fine jewelry and the click of handcuffs and the opposite wall of a holding cell. She thought about what was available to her now that had not been available to her then. She thought, the old is gone, the new is here. She was 30 years old. She had, for the first time in 22 years, nothing hidden. No storage unit, no locked compartment, no parallel architecture of secrecy running beneath the surface of her life. The storage unit had been emptied over 6 weeks, the contents donated anonymously or returned where possible, in the sober, painstaking, necessary work of making restitution that her attorney and her pastor and her therapist had all told her was important, and that she had found to be true in the specific way that hard, true things are true. Not comfortably, but completely. She was standing on the steps thinking about all of this when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She almost dismissed it. Then she read it. "My name is Kezia. I think you might be the Meredith Waneshi I went to Parkway Elementary with. I saw the story about your case in a local article. I wasn't going to reach out, but I felt like I should. I don't know why. I've been thinking about you for weeks. Are you okay?" Meredith stood on the church steps in the June light and stared at the name. Kezia, the friend from the dollar store. The girl who had been spinning the jewelry rack on the afternoon everything started. The person who had been standing right next to her when the charm bracelet went into her pocket 22 years ago and had never known. She typed back slowly. "I'm better than I've been in 22 years. I have a lot to tell you. Can we get coffee?" She sent it. She looked up from the phone at the June afternoon. The light doing something generous and uncomplicated across the parking lot of Calvary Seventh-day Adventist Church, the sound of people still laughing inside, the smell of food from the fellowship hall drifting through the open doors. The reply came in 40 seconds. Yes, absolutely. Meredith put the phone in her pocket, her hands clean, her pockets empty of everything that wasn't hers, and went back inside to the people who knew her, all of her, and loved her anyway. There is a version of this story that ends at the jewelry store, handcuffs and consequence, and the logical conclusion of 22 years of taking. And that would be a true story. Those things happened exactly as described. But the truest version of the story, the one Meredith Oneshi tells now, on Sabbath mornings at Calvary when Pastor Ames asks her to, the one that makes people in the congregation very still and a little undone, begins where the other one ends. It begins on a bench in a holding cell with a hymn she hadn't thought about since she was 12 years old. It begins with a friend who had been saying her name to God for 4 years without being asked to. It begins with, if anyone, anyone. That word has always been the most radical thing about the gospel. Not if the prepared person. Not if the person who found God before things got this bad. Not if the person whose sins are the acceptable kind. If anyone. Anyone is Meredith. Anyone might be you. The old has gone. The new is here. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone. The new is here. 2 Corinthians 5:17. Kleptomania is a recognized impulse control disorder affecting millions. It is treatable. Recovery is possible. If you are struggling, you are not alone and you are not beyond reach. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to be notified about more inspirational stories on redemption and hope.